Hello everyone, you're very welcome to this episode of Universal Design for Learning. In this episode I want to think a little bit about thinking and learning styles and just discuss that. I'll start off by saying there's a lot of educational research done on learning styles, and the general consensus is it doesn't seem to make a significant difference in students' performance if you categorize students or teach people specifically in a manner that is most congruent with their learning style. But I don't see that as particularly relevant. How I see it is it's important for the teacher to teach around a cycle of different teaching techniques. And models like learning styles at least suggest ways we could teach. I think a particularly daft concept that too many researchers are doing is identifying a student's learner style. Let's say they prefer to learn in a black room, and then teach them in a black room, and then show that their performance isn't particularly significant than if they were taught in a white room. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. What I think is if we teach a student sometimes in a black room and sometimes in a white room, then they're sometimes probably more comfortable in their learning when they're in a way that's accommodated, but we should also teach them in a manner that is not congruent with their learning preference, so they learn a range of learning strategies to cope with that. Because when they get a job, they're not going to get content given to them always in a manner that's most congruent with their learning styles or their preferred style. A lot of researchers argue that their learning styles are not stable constructs anyway, so there's a lot of significant critiques against them. But again, my feeling is that teaching around the cycle, teaching using these models are helpful just to think about ways in which we can more universalize our teaching, ways in which we can create teaching that gives people multiple pathways through. So I guess this whole idea of type theory came around based on Carl Jung's work. We would generally attribute it, I think in 1913 he wrote a book called Psychological Types that's usually suggested that there's different types of people, and these inbuilt tendencies are typically described as their natural responses to daily situations. And sometimes, they're defined as behaviours that you don't even notice. So Jung's model is simply that there's a human being that takes in information from an environment through their senses that goes into their brain. So it could be a classroom, and some students will take in the information one sense at a time. Jung called that the sensors, and some people will be able to take in multiple senses. We call those the intuitors. And then once that information is in their heads, some people will be able to use that information, make judgments based on their heart, and some based on their logic or their head. Jung's theory was good, but the books were extremely hard to get, so for expedient reasons, for war-based reasons, two psychologists, a mother and daughter team, Catherine Briggs and Isabella MyersBriggs, developed an instrument called the MyersBriggs type indicator to identify what kinds of people would be suitable doing what kinds of work. It's a very popular business personality inventory or psychometric test. So the Myers-Briggs type indicator is exactly like Jung's for the first two characteristics. Myers-Briggs agrees that you take in information either as a sensor or an intuitor, and that you make judgments based on your head or your heart. But the Myers-Briggs type indicator adds two extra characteristics, whether you're introvert or extrovert, or a judger or a perceiver. So as we said, the perception is somebody is either a sensor or an intuitor. A sensor, as well as taking in information one sense at a time, likes to gather data specifically and pays attention to details, whereas an intuitor will often be more big picture and relies on mixing up their senses together. A judger, in terms of making judgments, the people who are thinkers like to base their decisions on logic, whereas the people who the feelers like to make their decision based on emotions. The thinkers are generally more objective and the feelers are generally more subjective. In terms of where people get their energies, introverts are people whose energies are directed inwards, They're very good with concepts and ideas. They think before they speak, whereas extroverts, their energy is directed outwards. They prefer to interact with people. They get their energy there, and they often speak before thinking. The judgers and perceivers. The judgers are people who like decisiveness and closure. They value task completion or project completion, and the perceivers are flexible and are curious, and they like the start of the project. So it's worth mentioning judgers are people who will always get projects done to a deadline, whereas perceivers will miss the deadline by a mile. Douglas Adams said he likes the sound of deadlines whooshing by him, and I think he was definitely a perceiver in that sense. So we have introvert, extrovert, sensor, intuitor, thinker, feeler, and judger, perceiver. And that gives us 16 possible combinations. And sometimes people say, or lots of occupations have done the Myers-Briggs type indicator and have identified what occupation most highly correlates with what kind of jobs. That doesn't mean that there's people who don't have completely opposite MBT classifications in a particular job, but it just means the general trend is that people have this kind of orientation. So that's worth looking at if you're interested. And David Kiersey took the Myers-Briggs type indicator and boiled down those 16 categories into 4 categories, which he called the artisan, the rational, the guardian, and the idealist. This model is called a 4-quadrant model because there's 4 quadrants to it, and there's lots and lots of 4-quadrant learning styles models that are hitting the same point. They're saying that some people, the idealist, for example, is all about diplomacy, is all about harmony, is all about self and other improvement. So strong interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. There are people called guardians who value experience, security, and responsibility. They have logistical talents. They're very practical people. They like to observe traditions and rules. So they're very practical individuals. If we go down to the artisan, they're very creative. They like generosity. They like adaptability. They like new kinds of problems to solve. They want a variety of stimulation, and they like adventure. They just need to act. And then we have rationals. They're the logical ones. They value reason. They want facts. They have very good strategic talents. They express themselves calmly and follow a logical approach. So those 4 characteristics: the carer is the idealist, the practical person is the guardian, the creative person is the artisan, and the logical person is the rational. With many, many models of learning styles, you see those 4 characteristics. So again, if we were to develop content or get activities where we ask students to enhance their intrapersonal, interpersonal, the idealist, if we ask them to come up with practical content and do practical exercises, we'd be hitting the guardian. If we ask them to do creative things, we'd be hitting the artisan. If we ask them to logically reason about things, we'd be thinking about the rational person. So there's lots of these kinds of 4-quadrant models around, and it's certainly a way of viewing the types of students you might have in your class and a way of considering what kinds of activities you might give them. Another model is Farak, which doesn't look at the whole person, it just looks at the senses and suggests that there's visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic channels that people take in information in, and we should ensure that all 4 channels are addressed. A more complex model by Rita and Kenneth Dunn is the Dunn and Dunn model of learning styles, and it says that there are 5 different elements to consider: the environmental, emotional, sociological, physiological, and psychological elements. In terms of environmental elements, some people like to learn quietly and some need background noise. Some want a very bright environment, some prefer dark with maybe just a single desk lamp. Some learn better when it's hot and some learn better when the room is cooler. Some like very comfortable chairs and some like very hard chairs when they're learning. In terms of the emotional elements, some people are intrinsically motivated. They're motivated by themselves for reasons internal to themselves, whereas others are extrinsically motivated by other people or other conditions. Some take a lot of responsibility and are very conformist, and others are more rebellious. Persistence is really important. Some people are very good at persisting at a problem, and some people are not, and that seems to be a big factor in terms of people's success. And some people like a lot of structure when they're learning and when they're doing activities, and some are okay with only a little bit of structure. In terms of interacting with others, some like to learn alone, some like to work just in a pair, some like to work with a few peers, some like to work with a whole group of different kinds of people, some like an authority figure to tell them what to do, and some like a varied series of inputs. In terms of physiological elements, there's different preferences in terms of perception, and Farak is kind of what we're saying there. In terms of food, some people like to learn better on an empty stomach, some like to learn better with lots of food. A time of day, some people are night owls and some people work best in the mornings. Mobility, some people like to walk around while they're learning. Psychological elements, for example, a global or an analytic means some people need the overview first, whereas others can want to break things down and can take one thing at a time. And some people act before they think, they're impulsive, and some people think before they act, they're reflective. So that's the Dunn and Dunn model. It's quite an interesting and varied model. I'm not saying anything very unusual here, and I wanted to point this out by using the Harry Potter examples. On Harry Potter, the sorting hat sorts people out into the different houses. The Gryffindor for the brave, Hufflepuff for the loyal, Ravenclaw for the logical or wise, and Slytherin for the sneaky and cunning folks. This idea has been around forever. There's 4 humours according to ancient Greek medicine. Even ancient texts describe the 4 different types of Irish people, the Connacht people, the Ulster people, the Leinster people, and the Munster people as being having different characteristics. There's nothing new in this, and I'm putting a healthy dose or warning on top of this by saying research does tend to suggest that there isn't much in this in terms of its impact on student performance, although some ECG and brain scanning does tend to suggest that there are actually measurable differences that might correspond to some of these learning styles models, or at least some factors within the learning style models. But nonetheless, the only point we're making here is that if we pick any of the models I've mentioned and try and create variation in our teaching, variation in our assessment, variation in our interaction with students on the basis of these models, then at least we've given some diversity to the way we're teaching. And ultimately, we're going to end up with a better teaching experience with respect to universal design for learning. So thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode.